Hi, it's me, Tea Leaves. I got the spider story, and I had all kinds of stuff I was going to say beforehand, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to get into it. I will just one say. This has been edited and also not edited. Anyway, her eyes felt heavy, but she forced them open. She looked dazed, and her eyes looked hazy as she said, "No, I have to watch for the spider, or at some point it will come and get me." His voice was soft, quiet, and beginning to sound farther away. "It will come and get you." She murmured sleepily, her voice starting to drift off. "Not sure when, but at some point in this game it will get me, 'cause you didn't—" She trailed off. The wind blew, and she huddled down into his Letterman jacket. She felt his hand as he brushed a stray hair away from her cheek. Smiling, she leaned against him and kissed his cheek. Smiling, he pulled away to take her hand. He looked down as he brushed his thumb over the red stone of his oversized ring on her little finger. Then, looking up, he nodded his head in the direction of the stadium. Turning their gym shoes, squeaking against the pavement, they walked arm in arm across the parking lot. The stadium was busy and noisy, so no one seemed to notice when the wind blew. Not the other attendees, not the attendant taking the tickets, and certainly not the two sweethearts. None of them noticed when the wind blew and the world glitched. "Tickets?" the attendant asked them. Still arm in arm, they attempted to individually hand him their tickets without letting go of each other. Finally, successfully, much to the chagrin and annoyed eye-rolling of the attendant, they continued on through the gate. They walked along the outside corridor of the stadium, making their way to their seats, through the loud and excited crowd. They were walking past a particularly rowdy group by concessions when suddenly she gasped. "What is it?" he demanded protectively. Like a knight in shining armor, he wrapped his arm around her shoulder, protectively pulling her back, while putting out his other hand in front of them, poised to strike, swift like a blade, to cut down any foe that would dare threaten. "There!" she cried, her hand shaking as she points in front of them. Alert and ready, at eye level, he scans the area, but then, confused, asks, "Where?" "There!" she cries again, but this time her straight, pointed finger curls slightly downward. He realizes that she is pointing down, way down. "The paper cup?" he asks, still confused. She shakes her head. "No." Her finger still pointing as trembling she whispers, "Next to it." He squints his eyes. "The spider?" he asks doubtfully, his eyes going from the spider to at least compared to the little spider, the much bigger paper cup. She looks up pleadingly at her gallant knight and nods her head, saying, "Get it." Confused and not sure what to do, he starts to lean forward as he offers, "Okay, I'll scoop him up," but she cuts him off by grabbing his wrist and crying out, "No, it has to be gone, gone." He looks at her and smiles. "That little thing?" he says, staring into the eyes of his supposedly all animals matter girlfriend. She reaches out and grabs his wrist, her fingers pressing into his skin, her thumb resting on his heartbeat as she begged him through a whisper, "Kill it." His brow furrowed as he repeated her words. "Kill it? You can't be—" She interrupted, though. "Yes, I am," then continued with fear in her eyes that was real. "Because if you don't kill it, with its bones all crunchy, then at some point it will come and get me." Softly he smiles, to hide his amusement of her imaginary fear, and nodding his head, gently, he says, "For you." Then, with shoulders raised, he turned to face her demon foe. Releasing him to his tasks, she quickly turns away and scrunches her eyes and covers her ears. She doesn't want to hear the bones all crunchy. But then again, she just can't help herself. She hears his gym shoes as he steps away from her, and she feels lightheaded as she hears the stomp of his boot hitting the ground. "All done," he says, coming back to her. Taking her hand, he kisses it, says, "The evil has been vanquished, milady." In disbelief, she whispers, "What?" "But his bones didn't crunch," she says, as he's already leading her away through the crowd. She looks up at her shiny hero that the sun no longer shined on. He nods his head at other people that they know as they pass by them. Everyone seems to be talking, laughing, and just cheering the day. Escorting her to her seat, he gestures for her to sit. She does so, but looks at him and, confused, asks, "Which means—" Her voice trails off again as she slips into a deep thought. Shaking her head, she tries to forget, to move on like everyone would tell her. But she just can't. She just can't even be still, even with his comforting arm around her. It feels warm, but also strangely cold to her. She stares around, her mind breaking through and whispering, "Because you didn't kill it. At some point during this game, it will come and get me. Because you didn't kill it, I must stay watchful of where it could be. Because you didn't kill it." She started feeling dazed and heavy, like something invisible was wrapping over her. She stood up suddenly, breaking the invisible restraints like a puppet breaks free of its strings. And oddly enough, she felt kind of like a puppet, like she had been danced along and was acting out a story that was not hers, but yet still somehow familiar. She could feel something wasn't right, not just for her, not just in her mind, but everywhere. She blinked as she looked up at the white sky. It was fuzzy, but when she squinted, she could just barely make out what appeared to be straight blue lines in the paper white sky. Outside the stadium, a red pole like an antenna went from deep in the ground all the way up through the sky, creating borders or signals like a cell tower but without legs. Oof! She blew a bit of white fuzz out of her mouth. "Where did that come from?" she said, but her voice trailed off as she slowly looked around and saw more of that white fibrous fuzz floating down from a crinkly sky like snow. Threads of snow? "Michael," she called out quietly, blindly reaching down for her hero's arm. "We should get—" She gasped, then froze as she felt his arm through a covering of fuzz. "Oh, Michael, they got you. But I'll save you," she says, quickly looking around for a possible escape. And then she heard a dark chuckle behind her. "Save me?" the voice asked darkly, the amusement spinning all around her. Sucking in her breath, she slowly turned around to look at him. He wasn't looking at her, but it was still him. Still her Michael. He was sitting calmly, even though he had threads of that white fuzz covering his arm, only where she had touched him. He looked up at her from the corner of his eyes. Something didn't look right. She shook her head, and he began to stand up. Gasping, she froze momentarily as she watched his eyes change from pupils to shadows of a spider. Letting go of his arm, she backed away from him, saying, "You're not controlled or possessed by them." She neared the stairs as she stood to his full height, focusing on his eyes as the webs began to spin. She finished, "You are them." Spiders appeared in every crevice of the stadium and were crawling toward them. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You're like their master." He raised his black-gloved hands as he slowly started walking toward her. Tiny spiders began jumping from his fingers, dragging threads of web with them. She quickly looked around for possible escape. With both hands, he pointed 2 fingers at her, sending spiders flying at her. Swatting at the spiders and webs, she said, "Actually, you're more so like a deranged wannabe Spider-Man." Then turning towards the seats going up, she jumped onto the next seat going up and then dove, hands first, to the front row of seats continuing up. Like a skilled ninja, she used her hands to deftly and quickly open the seat, all while keeping the momentum and velocity strong. She rebounded off of it. Then, in a misdirect, she switched her direction and momentum into a backflip, narrowly escaping the spider's webs as she somehow, miraculously, magically, mathematically, and scientifically backflipped to now going all the way down to the top of the stone wall just before the field. She turned and looked up at him. His clothes had changed. In fact, now he looked like David Bowie. As if to confirm this, on his fingertips he was spinning black glass threads in a beautiful and mesmerizing way. He was weaving them into glass orbs, then spinning them back into webs, which turned white as he released them into the air. She sucked in her breath as she felt the snow threads spiraling around her, trying to consume her with their soft dance. She stared vehemently up at him. She couldn't help but marvel, thinking to herself, "Darn, why does he have to be so pretty?" From that distance she couldn't possibly have heard him chuckle, but she somehow did. He chuckled, his smile curling. Oh, no, she thought. He can read my mind? Looking back at him, he simply nodded at her. Right, she thought, as she looked down at all the snowy threads sticking to her, and then realizing how pretty that beautiful distraction really was. She wiped at the fuzz, but it was really sticky and now clinging to her hand. Things did not look good as the spiders were drawing nearer, crawling across the wall. They joined the others that were already entangling her with webs. Tears were starting to threaten like pools in her eyes as she looked up at him. "This isn't how you win a war, Michael, because it's not fair." Her vision was fuzzy. She could only focus on his eyes as he replied, "You say that often. I wonder what your comparison is." She sighed heavily, staring into his eyes. The spiders within made them deadly, but also beautiful. He was staring at something beyond her. Then with a blink his eyes looked up and then down at her. She felt strange. She felt an unspoken conflict. It was like a lover's fingers gently playing your heartstrings, just before they snap. Then she heard his soft whisper that never touched his lips. "As my world falls down." She wanted to press her hand against her heart, but her left hand was wrapped. She looked up at the horrible paper white sky, and then at him. Was he trying to tell her something? "As my world falls down," she repeated in her mind. What does it mean? Clearly he was in control. He had all the power. So his world wasn't falling down. Hers was. She tried looking around, but the webbing had made its way over her shoulders and was now tightening, causing her body to bend over like a super-stringed transformer that had froze just before turning into a ball. Then another part of her mind spoke. "Yeah, and why is the Spider King dressed like that?" Which is when realization hit her like a train wreck. Worried that he was following her train of thought, she looked at him. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't move. She continued thinking, reminding herself that whatever she figured out, she would have to be faster than Mr. Mindreader. "As my world falls, my world," she repeated, mumbling out loud. "More like your world," she said, glancing up at the sky, the paper white sky. She wondered how this story was going to end. Then the cleanup crew in her head began clearing that mental train wreck. Wait, this is my world. This was one of my stories. He had trapped her inside her own story, but being inside this world meant that there was another world outside. She just had to find a way to get there. Pause a moment, please. I'm sorry. Sorry, my mom came in. This is her room. So I have to, it's her space. Anyway. Okay, so she just had to find a way to get there. By now, the spiders had her almost encased, all except her right hand. Even though she could barely move it, the key was already in hand, which in the real world was her usual weapon of choice against spiders. Luckily, her one leg was shorter than the other, and even though she knew the math was impossible, she flicked her wrist anyway. Oddly, the item sailed up through the air and into the sky, causing everything to quake. This mostly affected the spiders in the sky as they clung to their fibrous webs, but the weight of their bodies were causing the sky to shred like ripping paper. Triumphant, even as the world was falling down around her, right before everything went dark, she curled herself to look up at him, bracing her feet, one barefoot and one still wearing a flip-flop, on the stone wall. She started calling out, "You have no power," but her voice died with an echo. Hold on one second. Like I said, I didn't edit, so there's a few notes here. She was groggy, laying curled around something. She smelled wood, so she figured she was curled around a tree. But nope, it was just the leg of that enormous desk. Her eyes were still heavy. She had been dreaming, which meant she had been sleeping, but she didn't feel rested. Darn dreams. They just never let me rest. And that's when she started laughing because she remembered it was her flip-flop. That's what she always used. Ta-da! And that's the spider story. Part of it. Enough of it.